9:43 p.m. A cold drizzle stretched across McKinney Avenue in Dallas, fogging up the front windows of Blackstone Grill and Prime and reflecting the red neon glow from the liquor store across the street. Soft jazz drifted through the ceiling speakers while the soda ice machine buzzed behind the bar and silverware clinked against porcelain plates inside the crowded Saturday night dining room. The valet lane was packed with Escalades and Range Rovers lined up under the late summer Texas rain, and the black entrance rug had turned completely soaked from hours of non-stop foot traffic. Blackstone Grill and Prime was always busiest on Saturdays. Emily Dawson had been on her feet for nearly 11 straight hours. Her ankles throbbed inside a pair of non-slip shoes she bought at Walmart for $48.99 back in February, and her phone had just buzzed again with another overdue payment email from Baylor Scott & White Pharmacy. The balance still owed was $842.16 for her younger brother Marcus's insulin. Marcus was 22, finishing his last year at community college in Arlington, and had just lost half his shifts at AutoZone the week before. Emily stared at the email for exactly 3 seconds before locking her screen again, before panic had time to settle in. She was too tired to panic anymore. Back in the kitchen, the ticket machine kept spitting out orders non-stop. Brandon Cole paced across the dining room with an iPad in one hand and tension all over his face like the entire restaurant was one bad review away from collapse. Corporate headquarters in Houston had sent him a warning email that morning after the Dallas location dropped to 3 stars on Yelp because of several service complaints. Brandon took that personally. He hated anything that made wealthy customers uncomfortable. At 9:47 p.m., the restaurant's glass front door swung open with a gust of rain-heavy wind. The man walking in was so tall he had to duck beneath the steel doorframe to avoid hitting his head. He wore a faded grey hoodie, a dusty old jacket darkened by rainwater around the shoulders, and worn black sneakers whose soles squeaked softly against the polished marble floor every time he stepped forward. Water dripped from his sleeves onto the tile in long narrow streaks beneath the warm yellow lighting. The hostess stopped smiling instantly. Emily noticed the reaction almost immediately. A couple in designer suits near the wine display turned and stared at the man with visible irritation. A woman at table 12 quietly pulled her Chanel purse closer to herself as he walked past. The security guard at the service hallway instinctively touched the radio clip to his belt. Nobody said anything out loud, but Emily had worked in restaurants long enough to recognize that kind of silence. The entire room had already decided he didn't belong there. The man lowered his hood slowly and looked around the dining room without any hurry. Emily expected him to avoid eye contact the way many homeless people near the DART station on Pearl Street usually did. But he didn't. He studied the security camera mounted above the bar. He noticed the emergency exit beside the wine wall. He watched how the servers moved between tables and how the kitchen staff pushed carts of meat through the hallway in the back. He looked at the restaurant like someone who had once managed a place like this himself. Brandon spotted him at almost the same moment Emily did. He dropped his iPad onto the host stand a little harder than necessary before walking over with the polished smile Emily knew only appeared when he was trying to hide irritation. "Good evening, sir. Do you have a reservation tonight?" Brandon asked in a voice so smooth it almost sounded kind. The man shook his head once. "No reservation." His voice was deep and unusually calm. "But I'd like the dry-aged ribeye, medium rare." Brandon glanced quickly from the man's worn sneakers up to his face. "Our wait tonight is about an hour and 20 minutes. The man nodded like that didn't bother him at all. Then he slowly reached into his old jacket pocket and pulled out a thick stack of cash wrapped with a blue bank strap. He placed 4 damp $100 bills onto the counter, one at a time. "Then I'll pay now." The atmosphere around the host stand shifted instantly. Emily caught Brandon hesitating for less than a second, just 1 second. But it was enough for her to see him choosing between his disgust and the money sitting in front of him. Finally, Brandon forced his professional smile back into place and motioned for the hostess to grab a menu. "Of course, sir. We'll prepare a table for you." The man simply nodded again and looked deeper into the crowded dining room behind Brandon. A young bartender polishing whiskey glasses glanced at him and whispered something to the waitress beside him. Both of them laughed quietly before looking away when they realized the man could see them. He didn't react. He just slid his old jacket off his shoulders slowly and folded it over one arm like he had spent years getting used to looks like that. The silence around him was starting to bother Brandon. "Table 16, Brandon told the hostess quickly. It was the worst table in the restaurant closest to the kitchen exit, loudest in the room, and directly beside the hallway leading toward the public restrooms. Every time the swing doors opened, heat, grease, and shouting from the kitchen blasted straight into that section of the dining room. Emily knew Brandon used that table whenever he wanted certain guests to leave as quickly as possible. The man followed the hostess without complaint. His old sneakers squeaked softly against the tile floor, and the oversized hoodie made him look less like a customer at an upscale Dallas steakhouse and more like a tired laborer walking home after a long shift. But as he passed Emily, he glanced once more toward the liquor display behind the bar and then up at the kitchen cameras again. His eyes were completely awake. And for the first time all night, Emily felt like something was about to happen inside that restaurant. 10:01 p.m. The dining room inside Blackstone Grill and Prime was entering the most chaotic stretch of the night. The kitchen ticket machine kept spitting out orders so fast that one of the line cooks had taped the cracked plastic cover back together earlier that week just to keep it running. The smell of seared beef mixed with burnt butter and red wine hung thick in the air, while the warm yellow lighting reflected off whiskey glasses and polished marble in a way that made the restaurant feel expensive, controlled, and carefully manufactured. Shaq sat alone at table 16. The table was tucked beside the kitchen exit and only a few feet from the hallway leading toward the public restrooms. Every time the swing doors burst open, heat, grease, and shouting from the kitchen poured directly into his section. A waiter accidentally brushed the back of Shaq's chair while rushing past with a tray of cocktails and apologized immediately out of instinct, but the nervous look in his eyes stayed there a second too long. Shaq simply nodded once. He lowered his hoodie slightly and wrapped one massive hand around a small glass of sparkling water. His fingers were so large the glass almost disappeared in his grip. He didn't drink from it right away. He just slowly rotated it between his fingers while quietly watching the dining room around him. A couple seated behind him switched seats so the woman wouldn't have to face him anymore. Near the bar, a young bartender glanced down at Shaq's worn sneakers and smirked at the waitress beside him. Shaq noticed all of it, but he said nothing. Emily crossed past his table carrying a tray of wine glasses when her phone buzzed again inside her apron pocket. Another text from her landlord flashed across the screen. Need remaining $410 by Monday morning. She locked the screen immediately before Marcus could call again, asking whether they would still be able to keep their insurance this month. Emily had worked enough double shifts in Dallas restaurants to understand one brutal truth about life in Texas. Lose your job for 2 weeks, and everything starts collapsing. The apartment, the insurance, the prescriptions, all of it. That was why nobody at Blackstone Grill and Prime ever stood up to Brandon Cole. From the host stand near the front entrance, Brandon kept glancing toward table 16 while pretending to chat with one of the restaurant's regular VIP guests. Emily could see the irritation growing more obvious on his face with every minute. Shaq remained seated in the dining room. Brandon hated anything that disrupted the atmosphere he sold to wealthy customers for hundreds of dollars a night. And Shaq, sitting there in a faded hoodie and old sneakers, was slowly becoming a problem Brandon couldn't ignore anymore. Shaq's presence was embarrassing him. A woman in diamond bracelets at table 14 finally waved Brandon over. "He's still here?" she asked loudly enough for Emily to hear while carrying steak knives past the table. Brandon leaned closer politely. "I'm very sorry, Mom." The woman frowned and glanced toward Shaq. "People don't come to places like this to sit beside homeless men." Emily saw Brandon nod almost instantly. No hesitation, no pushback. Just the quiet agreement of a man who had spent years learning how to protect wealthy customers from discomfort at any cost. At table 16, Shaq remained completely still. He watched Brandon speaking to the woman through the reflection in the wine display glass. Then his eyes drifted toward the kitchen swing doors behind him, where the shouting from the grill station was growing louder by the minute. His gaze paused briefly on the security camera above the bar before returning to the untouched glass of sparkling water in front of him. He was memorizing everything. At 10:08 p.m., Brandon shoved through the kitchen doors and called out sharply, "Ryan, back here." His voice stayed low enough to keep the guests from hearing, but it still carried enough force to make several line cooks stop moving for a second. Ryan Mercer removed his gloves and followed Brandon toward the back prep area beside walk-in cooler number 2. Emily happened to be grabbing folded napkins from a stainless steel shelf near the spice rack. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but restaurant kitchens were too small for real secrets. Use the Jenkins ribeye from last night, Brandon said quietly. The homeless guy won't know the difference. Ryan froze almost immediately. That steak sat out too long. Brandon crossed his arms. It's still usable. Ryan shook his head slightly. Trevor left it outside for almost 2 hours before putting it back. A short silence settled between the sound of sizzling fryer oil and the vibration of the industrial exhaust fans overhead. Brandon stepped closer and lowered his voice even further. Nobody's going to care if someone like him gets sick. Emily went completely still behind the spice rack. Her heart slammed hard enough that she had to set the stack of napkins down before dropping them. She could still hear the ticket machine, printing orders behind her, and a dishwasher cursing after breaking a cocktail glass near the sink, but everything sounded far away now as Brandon kept talking. We are not losing another VIP table tonight because some homeless guy wants to sit here pretending he belongs. Ryan didn't answer immediately. Emily watched him clench both hands tightly in front of his stomach. His wife had delivered their baby prematurely back in March at Presbyterian Hospital, and they were still drowning in NICU bills. Just last month, Ryan had sold his 2017 Ford F-150 to cover another $3,600 hospital payment. He wasn't the type of man who ignored food safety laws. But Brandon knew Ryan also couldn't afford to lose this job. Do you want to keep working here or not? Brandon asked quietly. He didn't yell. That was what made it worse. Ryan stared at the floor for several seconds. Then he nodded once. And for the first time that night, Emily felt genuinely afraid for the man sitting alone at table 16. 10:14 p. Emily was still standing behind the spice rack with both hands ice cold, even though the kitchen was so hot the back of her black work shirt clung to her skin. Brandon's footsteps faded through the swing doors as he walked out of the prep area, while Ryan remained frozen beside walk-in cooler number 2 like a man who had just signed something he already regretted. At the grill station, the old ribeye was pulled from a metal tray, placed on the cutting board, and covered with butter, salt, and rosemary, as if seasoning alone could erase what it really was. Emily knew that steak should never leave the kitchen. Through the narrow gap between the spice shelf and the kitchen doors, she could still see Shaq sitting alone at table 16. He hadn't touched the bread basket, hadn't checked his phone. He simply rotated the small sparkling water glass slowly in one massive hand, while occasionally glancing toward the kitchen doors like he could hear more than people realized. A group of customers walking past his table deliberately shifted closer to the wall to avoid brushing against the old jacket hanging over the back of his chair. Shaq noticed that too, but he stayed silent. Emily swallowed hard and glanced down at her phone again. 10:16 p. Another text from Marcus lit up the screen. I'm okay. Don't worry about me. I can probably skip one dose tonight. That message hit her harder than anything Brandon had said all evening. If she lost this job, she lost her insurance. If she lost insurance, Marcus would have to choose between insulin and tuition. If she caused trouble tonight, Brandon could easily write her up for insubordination and make sure no upscale restaurant in Dallas hired her again. She had every reason in the world to stay quiet. At 10:18, Ryan placed the ribeye onto the grill. The meat hissed loudly against the hot cast iron, while smoke rose into the air, carrying the smell of burnt butter and cracked black pepper. From the dining room, it would look perfect. A beautiful dry-aged steak worth $312.47. Nobody out there would ever know the meat had sat outside safe-holding temperature for nearly 2 hours the night before. Nobody would know Brandon had chosen it not because of an accident, but because he believed the man eating it was someone nobody would defend. Emily stepped backward, slowly. She almost collided with the dishwasher, pulling another rack of glasses from the machine. You good? He asked quickly, sweat dripping down the side of his face. Emily nodded automatically, even though her throat felt tight. She couldn't think clearly in this kitchen. There were too many cameras, too many people afraid of Brandon, too many workers who had learned survival mattered more than honesty. So she walked toward the employee restroom. The restroom sat at the end of a narrow hallway, beside a broken soda vending machine that had been buzzing non-stop since spring because management refused to replace it. Emily stepped inside, locked the door, and stared at herself beneath the pale fluorescent lighting. She saw a 34-year-old woman with tired red eyes, dark hair tied back with a stretched black hair tie, and a scratched-up name tag that read Emily hanging crooked against her chest. For a few seconds, she just stood there breathing. Then she remembered something her mother once told her years earlier in room 312 at Methodist Dallas Hospital. Sometimes people don't lose themselves because they're poor. They lose themselves because they pretend not to see what's wrong. Emily closed her eyes tightly. Then she pulled her order pad from her apron pocket. Her hands shook while she tore off a small corner of receipt paper. She grabbed the red Sharpie she normally used for allergy notes and wrote quickly before she could change her mind. "Don't eat the steak. They knowingly served unsafe meat." She read the words twice before folding the tiny paper small enough to disappear into her palm. No dramatic warning, no long explanation. Just the truth written clearly enough to save somebody. The note weighed less than a coin, but it felt heavier than anything she had ever carried. When Emily returned to the kitchen, Ryan was placing the finished ribeye onto a large white plate beside mashed potatoes, grilled asparagus, and a glossy streak of demi-glace. He looked up at her, and for one brief second, they both understood exactly what the other person knew. Ryan shook his head slightly, almost pleading with her not to do something reckless. His eyes looked terrified, not cruel. Emily didn't hate him for that. She simply stepped toward the pass window and lifted the plate carefully with both hands. Heat from the steak rolled upward into her face, carrying butter, garlic, and something faintly sour she wished she hadn't recognized. Brandon stood near the bar, watching her through the reflection in the wine display glass. She knew he was paying attention. She also knew that one wrong move would send her into the office behind the kitchen, before she even had the chance to explain herself. Emily started walking toward table 16. Every step felt longer than the last. The table sat less than 10 feet from the kitchen doors, but that night it felt like a hallway with no way back. A customer at table 14 frowned as she passed, while Brandon remained motionless beside the bar with his iPad folded against his chest. Shaq looked up the moment she approached. He glanced first at the steak, then directly into her eyes. Emily placed the plate down carefully. "Your dry-aged ribeye, sir," she said clearly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Medium rare as requested." Shaq held her gaze without blinking. Emily set the folded napkin beside the plate. Then, while adjusting the steak knife near the edge of the table, she pressed the tiny folded note carefully into his hand. Shaq's massive fingers closed around it almost invisibly. Nobody nearby seemed to notice, but Emily felt it. He understood immediately. "Enjoy your meal," she said softly. Then she turned away before her face betrayed her. Behind her, Shaq waited exactly 7 seconds. He lowered one hand beneath the table, unfolded the small receipt note in the shadows, and read every word slowly. For the first time all night, something shifted in his eyes. Not panic, not loud anger, just a deep, cold stillness, like an old memory had quietly reopened somewhere inside him. He set the steak knife down beside the plate, and he never food. 10:27 p.m. The dinner rush inside Blackstone Grill and Prime had finally started slowing down. The kitchen ticket machine wasn't firing non-stop anymore, but the atmosphere inside the restaurant had somehow become even tighter. Soft jazz floated through the ceiling speakers beneath the warm amber lighting. Expensive Cabernet Sauvignon continued flowing at the VIP tables tiles near the wine wall, and servers kept moving with polished smiles across the marble floor. But more and more eyes had begun drifting toward table 16, where Shaq still sat alone with a $312.47 ribeye growing colder by the minute. The steak was barely touched. Shaq remained completely calm. One enormous hand rested beside the sweating glass of sparkling water, while the other slowly rotated the silver steak knife under the dim dining room light. He didn't check his phone, didn't complain, didn't call anyone over, and somehow, that silence was starting to bother Brandon Cole more than an angry customer ever could. Because the man at table 16 wasn't reacting the way Brandon expected. A normal homeless guy would have devoured the steak in 10 minutes, or acted nervous, embarrassed, grateful just to be allowed inside. But Shaq didn't shrink into himself at all. He sat there like a man who could stay all night if he wanted to, calmly watching every server who passed by, every security camera mounted overhead, and every guest whispering nearby. His silence was beginning to pressure the entire room. Emily was refilling iced tea at table 11 when she heard the woman in diamond bracelets at table 14 call Brandon over again. "He's still sitting there?" The woman asked loudly out enough for nearby tables to hear. Her husband stared down into his bourbon glass like he wanted no part of the conversation. "This is supposed to be an upscale restaurant." Brandon leaned closer with a practiced smile. "I understand completely, Ma." The woman glanced toward Shaq with visible disgust. "Honestly, he smells like rain and street clothes." Emily stood less than 10 feet away. She saw Brandon glance toward table 16 and tighten his jaw. This was no longer about a poorly dressed customer sitting in the wrong restaurant. In Brandon's mind, Shaq had become a threat to the atmosphere he worked so hard to sell to wealthy people every night, and Brandon was beginning to panic. He adjusted his tie and walked directly toward table 16. The squeak of Shaq's old sneakers echoed softly against the marble floor as he shifted slightly in his chair while Brandon stopped in front of him. Emily froze beside the beverage station, her heartbeat pounding so loudly she could barely hear the music anymore. "Sir," Brandon began smoothly, "I'm going to have to ask you to finish up soon." Shaq looked up at him calmly. "I already paid, of course." Brandon kept smiling. "But some of our guests are feeling uncomfortable tonight." Shaq slowly looked around the dining room before returning his eyes to Brandon. "Uncomfortable because I'm eating dinner?" A short silence settled between them. Brandon didn't like the way the man spoke. Not aggressive, not loud, just too calm, like someone who had heard words like this many times before and stopped being surprised years ago. Somehow that made Brandon feel like he was the one being judged now. "Sir," Brandon said more carefully, "this restaurant has certain standards." Shaq didn't answer immediately. He glanced down at the untouched steak in front of him. "Funny," he said quietly, "I was just thinking the same thing." Emily saw Brandon's face tighten instantly. That was the moment he decided to turn on her instead. Brandon turned sharply toward the beverage station. "Emily." His voice carried just loudly enough for nearby guests to stop talking. "Come here for a second." Emily felt her stomach drop. She set the iced tea pitcher down carefully and walked toward table 16 with the awful feeling that everyone in the room was watching her. A server passing nearby gave her a nervous look before quickly looking away. Nobody at Blackstone Grill and Prime ever wanted to become the next employee called into Brandon's office behind the kitchen. "Did you say something inappropriate to this guest tonight?" Brandon asked. Emily blinked in confusion. "What?" "Several customers have complained." Brandon's corporate smile never moved. "They said you appeared overly familiar and unprofessional." Emily stared at him in disbelief for several seconds. She understood immediately what he was doing. Brandon couldn't remove Shaq from the restaurant without making a scene in front of customers, but he could make Emily the problem instead. "Brandon, I didn't." He cut her off immediately. "I think it's best if you clock out for the evening." The entire area around table 16 went silent. A bartender stopped polishing glasses halfway through. Ryan stood frozen in the kitchen doorway but didn't dare step forward. The woman at table 14 folded her arms like she was finally watching the restaurant restore order. Emily felt heat rise behind her eyes, not because she was embarrassed, because she already knew exactly how this story ended. Brandon would write her up for inappropriate guest interaction. Corporate would side with the manager before they ever listened to a waitress. And if she lost this job for even 2 weeks, Marcus would probably stop buying insulin just so they could keep their apartment. But the worst part was the silence around her. Nobody spoke up, nobody. Shaq remained seated through all of it. His huge hands rested quietly beside the untouched steak cooling beneath the warm dining room lights. He looked at Brandon, then at Emily, then across the entire restaurant, pretending this was all normal, pretending this was just another night in the American service industry. Something in his eyes changed slightly, like a man realizing he was staring at a system he had hoped no longer existed. 10:41 p.m. The rain outside Blackstone Grill and Prime had grown heavier, streaking down the front windows in long distorted lines beneath the red neon glow from the liquor store across the street. Inside the dining room, the silence had become so thick Emily could hear the soda ice machine buzzing behind the bar and the soft clink of a whiskey glass being set down near the VIP section by the wine wall. Nobody was speaking loudly anymore. Nearly every person in the restaurant was watching table 16. Shaq still hadn't moved. Emily felt her throat tighten as Brandon extended one hand toward the service hallway, like he was politely asking her to disappear before the situation became more awkward. "Clock out, Emily," he said quietly, but loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "We'll discuss this with HR on Monday, HR." One word was enough to make Emily's stomach twist. In the Texas restaurant industry, meeting with HR usually meant someone was already halfway fired. Emily glanced around the dining room one last time, hoping somebody, anybody, might say something. Ryan stood frozen in the kitchen doorway. A bartender quickly looked away and pretended to polish glasses. The couple at table 14 remained silent, like Emily herself was simply another unpleasant problem that needed to be removed from their expensive dinner. Nobody wanted to stand beside the vulnerable person in the room, because everyone was terrified of becoming vulnerable next. Emily took a slow breath and reached down to remove her order pad from her apron. And at that exact moment, the leather chair at table 16 scraped softly across the marble floor. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough to make the entire dining room turn toward Shaq, almost simultaneously. Shaq stood up slowly. He towered over everyone in the restaurant so completely that the warm overhead lighting cast his shadow across the edge of nearby tables. The faded grey hoodie still hung loosely from his shoulders, and his old sneakers squeaked softly against the floor as he stepped out from the narrow space between table 16 and the service station. Brandon instinctively stepped backward half a pace before realizing he had done it. Shaq looked directly at him. "Before she leaves," he said, his deep voice calm but clear enough to carry across the dining room, "I have a few questions." Brandon forced his corporate smile back into place. "Sir, this is an internal staffing matter." Shaq nodded slightly. "Then maybe you can explain why your internal staffing matter started immediately after she warned me not to eat the steak." The room went completely still. Emily felt her heartbeat stumble inside her chest. Brandon blinked rapidly once before immediately turning toward her. "What exactly did you tell him?" Shaq answered before Emily could even speak. "Actually, let's start simpler." He placed one hand against the back of the empty chair beside him. "What's your food holding policy for returned steaks?" Brandon stared at him. "Sir, I'm not discussing kitchen operations with customers." "Interesting." Shaq nodded slowly, like he was mentally filing something away. "Then maybe we can discuss your camera retention policy instead. How long do you keep audio recordings in management areas?" For the first time all night, Brandon genuinely lost composure. "Who exactly are you?" he asked. Shaq didn't answer immediately. He lowered his eyes toward the untouched ribeye, sitting beneath the dim dining room lights. The steam had disappeared long ago. A thin layer of hardened fat had started forming near the edge of the plate. Shaq rotated the steak knife once beneath his fingertips before looking back up at Brandon. "I'm someone who's eaten in enough restaurants to know when the staff is afraid." Nobody in the dining room moved. Brandon tried to smile again, but this time it didn't hold. "Sir, if you have concerns, you're welcome to contact corporate during business hours." Shaq looked directly into his eyes. "I already did." Then he bent down and untied his right sneaker. A few nearby guests grimaced instinctively, expecting something strange or embarrassing. Instead, Shaq reached into the torn side of the shoe sole and pulled out a small black phone hidden inside the foam lining. Brandon's face immediately lost color. Shaq pressed one button and placed the phone gently beside the untouched steak. "I've been recording since 9:41 tonight," he said calmly, "including the conversation behind your walk-in cooler about the returned ribeye from last night." A sharp inhale came from table 14. Ryan froze completely in the kitchen doorway. Emily felt all the warmth leave her body as Brandon slowly stepped backward again. "Sir, I think there's been some misunderstanding." The restaurant's front doors suddenly swung open before Brandon could finish speaking. 3 people entered from the rain-soaked Dallas street outside. A woman in her 40s wearing a charcoal grey suit walked in first, followed by 2 men carrying compliance badges from Armitage Dining Group, the hospitality company that owned Blackstone Grill and Prime, along with 13 other steakhouse locations across Texas and Oklahoma. The security guard near the entrance immediately stepped aside when he saw the corporate credentials. The woman removed her rain-soaked coat and looked directly toward table 16. "Mr. O'Neal," she said, "we received the live audio feed." The entire restaurant went silent. Emily watched the woman at table 14 slowly stare back toward Shaq like she was finally seeing his face clearly for the first time beneath the dining room lights. A bartender dropped the towel he had been holding onto the floor. Ryan leaned heavily against the kitchen doorway, like all the strength had suddenly drained from his body. Brandon stared at Shaq without blinking. "Shaquille O'Neal?" he whispered. Shaq didn't answer immediately. He simply stood there in the middle of the dining room, wearing the same old hoodie, the same worn sneakers, and the same calm expression he had carried all night. But now, everyone in the room finally understood why the giant man at table 16 had never behaved like someone ashamed of being looked down on, because he had never forgotten what that feeling was like. 10:52 p.m. Rain continued hammering against the front windows of Blackstone Grill and Prime, while inside the dining room almost nobody touched their food anymore. Soft jazz still drifted from the ceiling speakers, but now it sounded strangely out of place inside the thick silence hanging over the restaurant. A waiter stood frozen beside the beverage station, holding a tray of martinis for nearly 10 seconds before realizing he still hadn't delivered them to table 9. Nobody was looking at Shaq like a homeless man anymore. But what truly terrified Brandon Cole wasn't Shaq's identity. It was the small black phone sitting beside the untouched ribeye at table 16. Brandon understood exactly how fast that recording could destroy everything he had spent 5 years building at Blackstone Grill and Prime. The Yelp ratings, corporate trust, quarterly bonuses, his reputation, all of it. And for the first time that night, Brandon no longer controlled the room. "Let's slow down for a second," he said quickly, trying to steady his voice, even though tension was visibly tightening his jaw. "I think this whole thing is getting blown out of proportion." Shaq watched him carefully before responding. "A returned steak sat outside safe holding temperature for almost 2 hours, he said calmly, like someone reading from an internal report instead of arguing. "Your staff was pressured into serving it because you assumed nobody would care if I got sick." Nobody in the dining room spoke. The woman in the charcoal grey suit stepped closer and placed a black folder on the edge of table 16. The badge clipped to her jacket read, "Dana Whitmore, Regional Compliance Director." She opened the folder quickly. "We've received 3 anonymous complaints about this location over the last 7 months, Dana said without taking her eyes off Brandon. "Food safety, employee intimidation, selective treatment of guests." Brandon immediately turned toward her. "Dana, come on. You know how employees complain when pressure gets high. Pressure doesn't change food safety law." That sentence silenced the room again. Near the kitchen doorway, Ryan Mercer still stood motionless beneath the fluorescent lighting spilling out from the prep station. Emily could see both of his hands, trembling slightly at his sides. Ryan had never wanted things to go this far. He just wanted to keep his job, just wanted to pay off the mountain of hospital bills left behind after his wife's premature delivery back in March. But now, watching Brandon continue trying to spin everything into a misunderstanding, Ryan finally understood what Emily must have felt standing alone in front of the entire dining room earlier that night. Fear, left alone long enough, turns people quiet. Shaq slowly turned toward Ryan. He didn't yell, didn't pressure him. He simply looked at him for several long seconds before asking quietly, "Did he tell you to use the returned steak?" Ryan didn't answer immediately. The kitchen behind him had gone almost completely silent. A dishwasher stopped drying glasses beside the sink. One of the line cooks lowered his eyes to the floor. Nobody wanted to get involved, but nobody could pretend they didn't know what was happening anymore either. Brandon took a quick step toward Ryan. "Think very carefully before you say anything." That became the biggest mistake he made all night, because for the first time, everyone in the restaurant heard fear in Brandon's voice. No more polished manager tone, no more corporate confidence. Just a man desperately trying to keep authority from slipping out of his hands. Ryan swallowed hard before finally looking up. "Yes," he said quietly. "He told me to use it." A sharp breath escaped from somewhere near the bar. Brandon spun around immediately. "Ryan, what the hell are you doing?" Ryan clenched both fists tightly. "That steak should have been thrown away last night," he said, his voice shaking but growing stronger with every word. "Trevor left it sitting out too long after a customer sent it back." Brandon said nobody would care if the guy eating it got sick. Emily closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, not because she was surprised, but because someone had finally decided to tell the truth out loud. Dana Whitmore immediately turned toward the 2 compliance officers behind her. "Freeze kitchen operations. Nobody throws anything away." One of the officers pulled out his phone and called Dallas County Health Department on the spot, while the other headed straight toward the walk-in coolers. Brandon stared at them like he genuinely couldn't believe this was happening. "Dana, you can't shut us down on a Saturday night." "Watch me." Across the dining room, several guests had already started recording videos on their phones. A bartender whispered, "Jesus Christ," under his breath, while health department paperwork was placed on the host stand near the front entrance. The woman from table 14 had gone pale. Her husband slowly pushed his steak plate away from himself, like he no longer trusted anything coming out of the kitchen. Everything began collapsing very quickly, but not in a Hollywood way. No police stormed into the restaurant. Nobody was instantly handcuffed. There was no dramatic screaming. It was simply the American corporate system finally functioning the way it was supposed to after too many months of being ignored. Compliance reports, documentation, liability assessments. Dana requested all security footage beginning at 6 p.m. A compliance officer started photographing storage temperatures inside the kitchen. Armitage Dining Group's HR hotline was called directly in front of the staff. and Brandon slowly realized there was no way to talk himself out of this anymore. "Everybody's acting like I poisoned someone," he muttered, his voice hoarse now. "It was one steak." Shaq looked at him for a long moment. "No," he said quietly. "It was one person you decided didn't matter." That sentence silenced Brandon completely, because deep down, he knew it was true. He hadn't started out trying to hurt anyone. It had started with protecting the restaurant's image, then protecting wealthy customers, then protecting business metrics. And eventually, somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing a man in a faded hoodie as a human being and started seeing him as a problem that needed to disappear. Cruelty rarely arrives all at once. It grows slowly every time someone convinces themselves another person matters a little less. One of the compliance officers finally approached Brandon. "You need to leave the premises while the investigation is pending." Brandon looked around the dining room one last time. Nobody looked at him the way they had earlier that evening. The employees who once lowered their heads when he walked by no longer seemed afraid. The VIP customers who used to laugh politely at his jokes wouldn't even meet his eyes now. All that remained were cold expressions from people realizing they had been eating dinner inside something far uglier than they thought. And for the first time all night, Brandon Cole looked small. 3 weeks later, the weather in Dallas had started turning colder earlier than usual. Cold autumn rain stretched across Interstate 75 every morning, backing traffic up for miles from North Park Center all the way into downtown, while Blackstone Grill and Prime remained closed behind sheets of white paper taped across the front windows. The temporary notice from Dallas County Health Department hung crooked beside the entrance, its corners curling from rainwater and wind, while the valet lane that once overflowed with luxury SUVs now sat nearly empty, except for wet leaves blowing across the pavement. Everyone in uptown Dallas knew what had happened there. The videos from that night began spreading across TikTok and Facebook, less than 12 hours after the compliance team arrived. Nobody captured the entire incident, but enough clips leaked online to create the one thing corporate America feared most: public scrutiny. One video showing Brandon trying to remove Shaq from the dining room passed 2.4 million views in 3 days. Another clip captured the audio line, "Nobody's gonna care if someone like him gets sick," and local news stations across Texas replayed it for nearly a week straight. Armitage Dining Group moved fast. Brandon Cole was suspended Monday morning and officially terminated 8 days later after the internal investigation concluded. The final compliance report, nearly 40 pages long, confirmed multiple food safety violations had been ignored for months in order to maintain service speed and customer experience scores. 2 former employees also submitted complaints describing how Brandon routinely intimidated staff and selectively mistreated guests who didn't fit the atmosphere. Brandon wasn't arrested. This wasn't that kind of story. But he still lost almost everything that mattered to him. His Texas Food Service Management certification was suspended pending review. Armitage Dining Group filed a civil lawsuit to limit corporate liability before the health department investigation expanded further. And worst of all for Brandon, his name started appearing in local business news as another example of toxic restaurant management culture in Dallas hospitality. The man who built his life around image was being destroyed by it. Emily followed most of it on her old phone during breaks at the small restaurant in Lower Greenville, where she had started picking up temporary shifts. The place was nothing like Blackstone. No wine wall, no valet parking, no customers spending $1,000 after Mavericks games. But the manager there at least looked at employees like human beings instead of replaceable tools. Emily still worked double shifts almost every day trying to catch up on Marcus' medical bills, but for the first time in years, she no longer felt dread every time her phone buzzed with a work schedule notification. Shaq never once called her a hero, and Emily was grateful for that. One Thursday afternoon in early November, around 4:36 p.m., Emily stopped inside a small diner called Fairfield Corner Cafe in Plano after getting off work early. Light rain tapped softly against the windows while an old jukebox near the back wall played country music through static-filled speakers. Emily had just ordered a $3.25 refill coffee when she noticed a man walking in from the parking lot outside, Brandon Cole. For a second, she barely recognized him. No tailored suit, no glowing Apple Watch constantly lighting up his wrist. Brandon wore a simple gray jacket now, and he looked thinner than before, older somehow. He glanced around the diner for several seconds before finally spotting Emily seated near the window. He stood still for a moment, then slowly walked toward her table. "Can I sit?" he asked quietly. Emily didn't answer immediately, but eventually she nodded once. Brandon sat down across from her, folding both hands together on the scratched wooden tabletop. A waitress came over for his order, but Brandon only asked for black coffee before falling silent again. Emily didn't rescue him from the silence. Eventually, Brandon spoke first. "I kept telling myself I was protecting standards," he said quietly while staring down at the table. "That's what I believed," Emily said. "Nothing. Upscale clients, reputation, customer experience." Brandon let out a small laugh that didn't sound amused at all. "I repeated those words so many times they stopped sounding ugly in my own head." Rain tapped softly against the diner windows behind Emily. Brandon swallowed hard before continuing. "The worst part is, I didn't even notice when I stopped seeing people as people." He shook his head slowly. "I looked at somebody wearing old clothes, and all I saw was a problem for the restaurant." For the first time since sitting down, he finally looked directly at Emily. "I did the same thing to you." Emily felt something heavy settle inside her chest. Not pity, not forgiveness, just the strange feeling of watching someone finally see himself clearly after spending years hiding behind authority and polished professionalism. But realization arriving late still leaves damage behind. Brandon opened his mouth like he wanted to say more. Maybe apologize, maybe explain himself. But Emily stood up before he could continue. She placed a $5 bill beside her coffee cup and slowly slipped on her coat. "Take care of yourself, Brandon," she said softly. That was all. Emily stepped back out into the cold Dallas rain without looking behind her. Through the fogged diner windows, Brandon remained seated alone beside a cup of untouched black coffee, finally understanding what it felt like to be looked at like someone whose dignity no longer mattered. And for the first time in years, no job title was big enough to protect him from that feeling. 3 months after the night, everything fell apart at Blackstone Grill and Prime. Winter finally settled over Dallas. Cold wind moved through McKinney Avenue hard enough to shake the banners hanging outside storefronts beneath the yellow streetlights. Evening traffic still crawled through Uptown after work like it always did, but the building that once held Blackstone looked completely different now. The front windows had been replaced, the interior lighting softened, and the new black metal sign above the entrance carried a different name entirely. Grant and Table the restaurant no longer felt like a place desperately trying to prove how exclusive it was. At 6:12 p.m., Emily Dawson stood behind the host stand wearing a simple black suit and a new name tag that read, Emily Dawson, Floor Operations Manager. She was still the same woman. Same dark hair tied back with a black elastic band, same tired eyes of someone who had spent years surviving one paycheck at a time. But the way she carried herself had changed. Her shoulders sat straighter now. Her voice sounded calmer. And for the first time in her life working in restaurants, Emily no longer felt like she had to apologize for existing every time she clocked into a shift. Grant and Table had been packed since reopening week, partly because of the scandal, partly because Shaquille O'Neal had quietly become one of the restaurant's new investors, but mostly because of something simpler than either of those things. The staff inside the building had started treating people like human beings again. The new policy only contained one sentence. Every guest deserves dignity. No long corporate mission statement. No polished PR language. Just one line printed inside the employee handbook and mounted beside the staff time clock near the kitchen hallway. Emily had insisted on keeping those exact words after corporate suggested replacing them with something more professional. Because Emily understood exactly what it felt like to be treated like you didn't belong anywhere. At 7:03 p.m., the front doors opened beneath another wave of cold Dallas rain. An older man stepped inside slowly, wearing a faded olive-green military jacket with worn elbows, a grey knit beanie, and weathered boots still wet from outside. His grey beard looked uneven and overgrown, making him appear older and more exhausted than he probably was. The young hostess, eyed Emily, hesitated immediately. Emily recognized that look instantly. It was the same expression she had seen at Blackstone months earlier when Shaq walked in wearing his old hoodie and worn sneakers. That brief pause. That fear of making other customers uncomfortable. That quiet instinct to protect the atmosphere. Emily stepped forward before the hostess could speak. "Good evening, sir," she said warmly. "Table for one?" The man nodded carefully, avoiding eye contact out of pure habit, like someone who had spent years expecting rejection before it even arrived. "I don't have much money tonight," he admitted quietly. "Maybe just coffee." Emily smiled gently. "Coffee's free after 7 for veterans." The man looked up at her slowly, like he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. Emily simply picked up a menu and guided him through the crowded Friday night dining room. Nobody stared at him. Nobody requested another table. Emily led him all the way to the best seat in the restaurant beside the front windows overlooking uptown Dallas glowing beneath rain-soaked streetlights. "Take your time," she told him softly. The man took several seconds before finally answering. "Thank you." And for the first time since walking through the doors, his shoulders stopped tightening like he was waiting to be thrown back outside. Near the back hallway beside the kitchen entrance, a small frame display hung against the dark brick wall beneath a soft yellow light. It wasn't flashy. No spotlight, no giant photos of Shaq, no marketing campaign, just a small wrinkled piece of receipt paper preserved carefully behind glass. The red ink had already started fading slightly. "Don't eat the steak." They knowingly served unsafe meat. Beneath the note sat a small silver plaque with a single line engraved into it. "One small act of courage can stop a system from hurting people." Shaq walked into the restaurant about 10 minutes later, same oversized hoodie, same worn sneakers, squeaking softly against the floor, even though now everybody recognized him immediately. A few customers glanced over excitedly, but Shaq simply raised one hand politely before stopping near the entrance. He looked toward the elderly veteran sitting quietly beside the window with a warm coffee cup in both hands. Then he turned toward Emily. Emily gave him a small nod. Neither of them said anything else, because both of them already understood the most important thing about that night had never been the scandal, the investigation, or even the fact that a famous billionaire walked into an upscale Dallas steakhouse dressed like a homeless man. The most important thing was that a system built to make people feel invisible had finally been stopped by someone brave enough to see another human being clearly. If this story moved you, comment dignity below. And remember, sometimes the smallest act of courage can protect someone the world stopped seeing.